lucky enough that he was going to be in Western Australia for another event, so we snapped up the opportunity. Ken is, I've got a long list here of Ken's achievements, which I'm going to summarise. Ken has a PhD in economics and has chaired the Howard government's tax review task force in 97-98, the Rudd government's tax review that was published in 2010. He's been chair of the National Australia Bank, a non-executive director of the Australian Securities Exchange. He has various pins, a centenary medal recipient, and was made Companion of the Order of Australia in 2007. He's a country boy and a son of a timber worker, and now is the chair of the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation and Wildlife Recovery Australia, and a non-executive director of Accounting for Nature and the Digital Finance CRC. Everything that comes out of Ken's mouth, I think that makes so much sense. How can it be so simple? So I'm really looking forward to having this opportunity to ask him some tough questions tonight. The format, I'll have a conversation with Ken for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a brief comfort break for the bathroom and another beer, and then up to another 45 minutes of questions from the floor. So if you've got a question, there will be a chance to ask it in the second half of the evening. So Ken, I guess to start with, welcome to WA.
It's good to be here.
And first I'd like to talk about tax reform, which is obviously an issue that's been close to your heart for a really long time.
40 years.
Are you getting sick of talking about it?
I know I should be, so I feel that I must be a tragic of some sort. No, I'm not sick of talking about it, no. I
It's lucky for us, really, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, probably. Well, I don't. Well, let's see, right? Depends what I say.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I'm talking about it, I find that I find the content, some of it kind of ridiculous, because I think, well, you know, we settled thinking on that 40 years ago or 50 years ago or even longer, and yet we're still talking about it, and at times I can't understand that, and so at times I know I get frustrated, and I know I get even angry, and then at other times I think, wow, you know, this is the moment, right? The window of opportunity is open right now. This is when we could actually do it, and I guess that's why I've been able to sustain an interest in such a frustrating topic for so long.
I remember we had a conversation some time ago, and you were talking about the way our tax system actually indicates what we value.
Yeah.
And I found that a really interesting way into a tax reform conversation, because for a lot of people, tax reform sounds really dry and boring.
Yeah.
But tell us about how we show what we value through the tax system.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me start with a little anecdote. So I started working on tax policy in Australia at the end of 1984, right? So this is 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. And the first tax reform project I ever worked on, this is in the Australian Treasury, was the tax reform package that then Treasurer Paul Keating took to the National Tax Summit in the middle of 1985. So there was a small team of us, there were only 6 of us in the team in the Treasury, and we were not allowed to work on tax reform options until after the December 1984 election, because of the political sensitivity of tax reform as a topic for a relatively new Prime Minister, Bob Hawke. So we did no work on tax reform. I mean, we thought a hell of a lot about it, but you won't be able to find a document written on tax reform until after the December 1984 election. So we had 5.5 months, this team of 6 people, to produce, well, the biggest tax reform package that Australia had ever seen to that time. There have been much bigger ones since, but and one of the very first taxes that we considered, I mean, obviously the centrepiece of our work was going to be a switch between heavy reliance upon personal income tax to a much greater reliance upon indirect taxes in the form of what in those days we referred to as a broad-based consumption tax. It's really the precursor to our GST. And that idea that there had to be a tax mix switch had actually come out of the Asprey review that had reported in 1975, so 10 years earlier. And we thought, you know, I mean, everybody knew that Asprey was that's where the gold was, right? And this is what had to be done.
It sounds a bit familiar to me now, doesn't it?
Yeah. And yeah, I know. Well, you know, so Asprey was, this is how I keep myself sane, right? Asprey was published in 1975 and the GST was introduced 1 July 2000, so that's 25 years, right? My tax review's only been there for 15, right? So I'm okay.
There's hope. Yeah.
I'm okay, kind of. And so that tax mix switch was going to be the centrepiece, but what else was going to be there? Well, Asprey had also identified a lot of problems with the income tax system. So it was a very narrow income tax system, narrowly based, high rates, narrow base, top rate of tax, 60%, that was the top marginal tax rate, right? And yet, things like fringe benefits, completely tax exempt. You could have a company car, no tax at all, payable by anybody on that company car. So fringe benefits completely exempt. But the other big one, of course, which was the source of the political sensitivity that Hawke was worried about, was capital gains. So, what do we value? Very first conversation I remember us having about capital gains tax, I mean, it went something like this. I'm obviously paraphrasing, and the conversation probably occurred over a week rather than a few minutes, but it went something like this. So capital gains, yeah, well, they're a form of income. From an economic perspective, they're a form of income just like wages and salaries or rent or interest on a bank account. And yet, in Australia, they were, at the time, completely exempt from tax. And Asprey had set out a reasonably compelling argument as to why you should fix that loophole in the Australian income tax system. We thought, well, all we've got to do is to design this thing. First thing I learned about Australian values was, well, for God's sake, it can't possibly apply to the family home, right? That's sacrosanct. You cannot touch the family home, which is where the principal residence exemption came from. The second thing I learned is that, and this has some contemporary resonance, right, for Jim Chalmers anyway, is that, well, you can't tax unrealised gains. You know, you can't expect somebody to pay tax on a capital gain until they've actually sold the asset. And the third thing I learned was that when it comes to the way that we as a community or communities think about the retrospectivity of taxes, we are hypersensitive, right? And so we could have taken the decision, we could have built into the design that, well, the tax would only apply to capital gains that accrue after the start date of the tax, which was going to be the 19th of September 1985. Well, we didn't know that at the time, but we knew there had to be a start date. But of course, the capital gains tax built into it what at the time was called a grandfathering. I don't know what we'd call that these days.
I think we still call it grandfathering.
Really?
Yes.
Right,
Too
okay.
complicated
Well,
otherwise.
yeah. No, well, I was scratching my head about this earlier today, thinking, how should I describe this? If somebody wants to talk about it.
Grandparenting?
It's bizarre, isn't it? Anyway, so the way it works, of course, the way the capital gains tax works is that the tax doesn't apply at all to an asset unless the asset was acquired after the 19th of September 1985. That is, acquired after the 19th of September 1985. And there are still many assets out there in private hands which were acquired pre-19th September 1985, which have appreciated in value, presumably many of them, including harbourside mansions in Sydney, that are not necessarily owner-occupied properties, could be rental properties, could be commercial properties, and no capital gains tax payable. And those three features tell us something about Australian values. But there's a darker side to it, right? And the darker side to it is that in those conversations, I don't think anybody gave two hoots to the implications that those design features might have for people in years to come. And certainly not the implications that it might have for future generations, right? And so the mindset that drives those values home is a mindset that all that matters is the people who are in this room right now, you know, and we can agree on something that suits us and bugger the people outside of this room. We don't really care about them, and I find that quite challenging because it, you know, when I think about the Australian character in the abstract, I don't think of Australians that way. I don't think of them as being really selfish and lacking generosity. That's not how I think of them, and yet when you come to the design of the tax system, I can tell you, and I've been through more tax reform exercises than anybody else in this country, I can tell you that the only thing that matters is what's in it for you.
And so can 50 years later, so 50 years ago, the things you learnt about Australian values were don't tax my home, don't tax me on stuff I haven't actually got in my pocket, and don't change the rules on me.
Yeah, after I made it. Yeah.
50 years later, how have the decisions made then, and maybe, you know, that haven't been changed, what different story do they tell about our values now, especially when it comes to younger generations?
Yeah, well, I think that's the big lesson for us, right? The big lesson for us is that by concentrating so much on the impact on us individually, or if you like, the electorate as it is today, we've ignored the interests of those who are going to be affected in the future by the tax system as we design it. And so, you know, the way that property in particular, I'm talking about residential property, both owner-occupied and rental property, the way that it is taxed is indeed quite peculiar. And of course it can be said that, I mean, the owner-occupier housing exemption or the principal residence exemption, that is really peculiar. Like, you don't find that elsewhere in the tax system. You don't find something quite like that. The retrospectivity or avoidance of retrospectivity, our view was, well, if this is a price that has to be paid to get a better tax base, then okay, you know, over time this will disappear. It's just, it takes a long time for it to disappear. But the feature of not taxing capital gains until they are realised continues to dog policy making in this country. Now, I actually think that it's pretty hard to run an argument that people should be taxed on unrealised capital gains. And when I saw that the recently, well, the present government's, but the previous version of the present government's superannuation legislation proposed taxing unrealised capital gains in superannuation funds with balances above $3 million, I was shocked. I thought, well, how are you going to run this argument? On what basis can you run this argument? Because you know, there's sure I would expect that people who have superannuation balances of $3 million have got financial, well, of course they've got financial advisors who are capable of calculating accrued but unrealised capital gains. But that's not really the issue. If you've got a business that you're running through a self-managed superannuation fund, as a lot of people do, and there's real property asset owned by that business, and that's appreciated in value, there can't be an assumption that you're going to have the cash sufficient to pay the capital gain on the accrued capital gain on the unrealised asset. And I just couldn't understand where that thinking came from. So I get it, right? But now, think of rental property. So the way rental property works, of course, is that the capital gains tax is payable when the property is sold, but there's something special about capital gains, right? So only half the capital gain gets included as income. That's the first thing. And that was because of political unease between then Coalition and then Labor Party. This is when John Howard was leader of the opposition. There was political unease, and there was not a shared view that capital gains should be taxed at all. As a matter of fact, I don't know if some of you will remember this, I'm sure, but in the 1987 election campaign, John Howard, as leader of the opposition, vowed that if the Coalition were re-elected, the capital gains tax would be repealed in its entirety. And that was despite all the political blood that had been spilt on the floor of the Parliament in getting the thing legislated. And he took the same proposal to the 1990 election. But here's the thing. So half the capital gain is included, and the capital gains tax is payable only when the asset is sold. But because rental property is an income-producing asset, that is, rental income stream, all of the deductions associated with the cost of the property, they're all deductible in the year. And so you get this mismatch between deductions and income. Most of the income is actually in the form of capital gain for most rental properties, which is preferentially taxed, like only 50% comes in, and it's only taxed when the property is sold, which might be in 20 years' time. But all of the interest expense can be claimed as a tax deduction against other income, and that's what's meant by negative gearing, right? The negative gearing arises because of the mismatch between the ability to claim the expense, which is the interest expense, and the deferral of the capital gains tax. And so this notion that, well, you know, you can't tax somebody on a capital gain unless and until the property has been sold does not sit at all well with this idea that you should allow interest deductions immediately up front. And that is why investment properties are such a good look.
Yeah, good explanation of it. I mean, and so what you've said, we ended up in that situation through some compromises along the way. I'm interested in what you said about in 1975, there was a need to shift the tax mix away from personal income tax to passive income.
Yeah.
That's the year I was born. It's 50 years later now, and I feel like we're having that same conversation. How do you think the situation now compares to where we were historically in terms of tax mix and the need to shift that?
So that's a really good question, and I have actually done the numbers on that.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. So the top marginal tax rate is, of course, a lot lower than 60%, but it's just a little bit below 50%. And on international standards, Australia's top rate of marginal income tax is still relatively high. You may want to challenge that because there are some countries that have higher marginal tax rates, but they apply at 5 times average income or something, and ours does not. And so what we have is by international standards, a relatively high top marginal rate cutting in at a relatively low level of income, right? That's a feature of the Australian taxation system. So 60 has come down to roughly 50. That's some progress. We have also broadened the personal income tax base, so more income is subject to tax, like fringe benefits, although it is a separate tax, and that in itself is a problem, and capital gains, as I was talking about earlier, although that's preferentially taxed. But what about the tax mix switch? So the tax mix switch was all about placing less reliance on personal income tax in total, particularly personal income tax generated from workers, because that's where the big economic cost arises, the disincentive to work, and more tax from indirect taxes, things like sales taxes and so on, right? And the thing is, we are now, and so then we had the big tax, we had Keating's attempt in 1985, we had John Hewson's attempt from opposition in 1993, didn't get up, the Fight Back package. But we eventually got there through the tax review that that I had the pleasure of leading, and it was a pleasure, by the way, for, no, it really was, no, it was a fantastic exercise, for Prime Minister Howard. And eventually we got the tax mix switch in 2000, right? In the year 2000, got the tax mix switch. So, good question, right? So, did that change the balance of taxes between personal income tax and indirect tax? Yes, it did. But if we look at it today, where are we? Well, we're right back where we were in 1997, before the tax mix switch occurred. So we are now today placing more reliance on the personal income tax system as a proportion of total tax revenue than in 1997. And we're collecting less revenue, including from GST, less revenue from the indirect tax system now than we were in 1997, right? And so it's all been completely undone in 25 years.
By what?
Okay, so what's it been undone by? Two big things. Well, three big things. Compromise, right? And values, right? So that's one. So the design of the GST was a compromise. And again, it says something about Australian values. And you know, like today, given the sort of talk that we've had, and you and I have certainly had about intergenerational equity issues, it may seem bizarre, but the most contentious issue in the design of the GST back in the late 1990s was how to ensure that old people were going to be protected from the GST, so they didn't really have to pay much of it, right? They were the vulnerable ones. Like, you know, the older I get, the more I understand this. But they're the vulnerable ones, right? And so, I mean, it's an interesting. You'd probably never learn this bit about Australian history unless I tell you, so I'm going to tell you even if it bores you to death. The Howard government thought that it knew it was going to have to negotiate with the Senate in order to get the GST legislated. But who was it going to negotiate with? They had to negotiate because Labor said this is the work of the devil, you know, even though only a few years earlier Paul Keating had a very similar proposal, right? So this is the work of the devil, and so the government thought, the Howard government thought that it would negotiate with independent senator from Tasmania, Brian Harradine. They only needed him. That's all they needed. They just needed one, and so they thought they'd negotiate with him. And I remember I was on I was accompanying Treasurer Peter Costello to a meeting. It was somewhere in Southeast Asia. I can't remember where, but I do remember we stopped at Singapore to catch a different flight. We had to stop at Singapore, and Harradine was on his feet in the Senate as we were mid-flight, and he was going to deliver his considered verdict on whether he could support this package or not. And we had no idea, and there was nothing we could do about it, obviously. And we landed, and Peter got on the phone and called his office, and his face just drained of colour, as you would imagine. And he came over to me and he said, well, Harradine's not going to do it. And apparently what Brian Harradine had said, because I remember these words, is, I cannot in all good conscience vote for this legislation. Anyway, that was his view. And so that then meant that the government had to negotiate with the Australian Democrats. And the Australian Democrats, they no longer exist. The reason they no longer exist is because they entered into this negotiation. Yeah. And so there were extensive Senate inquiries into the impact of the GST on different types of people. But what the Democrats were worried about was the impact on old people, right? Because they were the politically sensitive group. I mean, they were the vulnerable group. And that's where the exemption from fresh food came from, right? And there are other that's precisely where it came from. And there are other design features of the GST designed to ensure that it impacts less on older people than it does on young people, right?
And what do you think now?
So, it's absurd, right? I mean, you would, well, despite my age, I think if you were to put something similar to the Australian Parliament now, and you were to run the argument that it's the older people who need to be protected from this tax mix switch, you get a horse laugh. Anyway, I hope you would. Anyway, you would certainly get a very violent reaction from the young people. But back then, in the late 1990s, there was no reaction from the young people. This was on. Well, this is just a kind of course, this is just this is just being fair to the more vulnerable people in society. And so the point about it is...
That goes to the heart, really, doesn't it, of what's changed?
Yeah, it really does. It really does, right? So that's the punchline.
Oh, sorry.
So the thing is that the GST was designed in a way that ensured that over time GST revenue would decline as a proportion of gross domestic product. We knew that from the time it was legislated, that although it was described as a growth tax, and that's certainly what we said to the states when we said you can have all the revenue, so please support it, we said you're going to get a growth tax. We knew that because of the design of the tax, its revenue was going to decline as a proportion of GDP over time. It doesn't apply to education, it doesn't apply to health, it doesn't apply to a whole range of things that we knew were going to grow in importance, right? So GST declines. But then what about tobacco excise? What about fuel excise, right? These are big heads of revenue in the indirect tax system. Well, they're going to decline too, and in fact, it's government policy to have people stop smoking, not to continue to pay tobacco excise. And it has been government policy for some time now that people stop paying fuel excise by moving to electric vehicles, So there are features of the indirect tax system that ensure that it just falls over time. So that's part of the answer. The other part of the answer, of course, as to why the tax mix switch has not been permanent, is that the personal income tax system contains this fiscal drag thing, this bracket creep thing, right? So personal income tax is the only tax in the Federation where, under normal circumstances, its revenue increases as a proportion of GDP. And government doesn't have to do anything for that to happen other than allow a bit of inflation in the system. You allow a bit of inflation in the system, and then what happens is people move up, people just getting income increases. Even if the income increases don't quite match inflation, doesn't matter, they're still going to be paying a higher average rate of tax on their income, right? And it just happens by stealth. Nobody has to do anything. No laws have to be passed by the Parliament. And on occasion, and this we're in the middle of an occasion. Well, no, actually, I don't know where we are in this occasion, but the occasion's been running since the global financial crisis now, so it's quite a long time. This occasion where you've got both sides of politics not wanting to draw attention to the work that fiscal drag is doing in raising the average rate of tax on the average worker in Australia. And so the personal income tax system is by far the most buoyant revenue base in the Federation because of fiscal drag.
So we have personal income tax growing as a proportion of GDP, GST shrinking as a proportion of GST, indirect taxes shrinking because of their design, property taxes designed based on the values that we're protecting the status quo. All these problems are pushing us in the wrong direction. What will it take to get movement on this? Why is it so hard to do tax reform? And what circumstances do you think need to exist to actually be able to have this conversation at a national level without people's eyes glazing over, and say this is why we need to change this?
Well, now it's time for the punchline, right? Yeah,
Over to
because the way that the equity issues or the fairness issues have been considered is in looking at a static group of people and saying, okay, who should pay more, who should pay less, right? Without thinking about what this tax design is going to do in the future, right? And so, and just looking at it, as we did from 1975 through to 1998, which is when we finished work on the Howard government's proposal, the big equity issue that was in front of us was how much of the tax burden should we transfer from workers to retirees and people who rely on capital income and wealth, right? Because we don't want to do too much, right? And so the consequence has been that because of tax design, we now have a system which is doing enormous damage to young people. See, young people, if you think about the way the life cycle works, right? I mean, obviously there are exceptions, right? But the way the life cycle works is young people start with nothing but a job. If they're lucky, they've got a job. And that's all they've got. So they've got no capital income. They're certainly not retirees. The tax they pay is predominantly personal income tax, and they pay GST. And then, if they're lucky, they get to accumulate, well actually not if they're lucky. I mean, one feature of the Australian system is that you've got no choice but to accumulate superannuation, right? That's something. So they accumulate wealth through their lifetime. They accumulate, therefore, capital income through their lifetime. They might, and this is a case of luck now more than anything else, they might be lucky enough to be able to get a capital sum transferred from their parent to allow them to get into the property market, and they get on that ladder and they can accumulate wealth through that mechanism at all, as well, right? But through most of their working lives, they're asset poor, and most of their income, maybe all of their income, is coming from the personal income tax system. And when they look at people of, well, my age, they find it, well, inexplicable that my average rate of tax on the income that I receive should be so much lower than theirs. Right? They just can't understand it, right? And I can't explain it to them either because I think it's kind of all screwed up, right? And so we have, by focusing on, by considering equity issues or fairness issues, only by looking at the people who are in the room at the time and not bothering to think about the consequences for those who come after us, we have delivered very considerable intergenerational injustice. That's what we've done. Yeah.
And I guess building on that in relation to housing, which is I think the way that this manifests the most, and I speak to a lot of angry people in their 20s actually who are saying, I'm working hard, I've got a massive uni debt, I can't imagine a day when I can afford a house. We bought our first house in 1999 when the average house was 4 times the average income.
Yeah.
It's now about 9 times. My 2 questions for you. Firstly, what should it be? Like, what's the right level of affordability? And secondly, how do we get there?
Yeah. I'm not sure that I know how to answer the first question, but because the one way of thinking about it would be to ask yourself the question: what proportion of an average income is it reasonable to expect that people have to devote to the repayment of a mortgage in order to be able to secure home ownership over, let's say, a 30-year time period, right?
And 30% is housing stress, isn't it? The definition.
Yeah. Well, see, I think at today's rates, I think even at 4 times income, I think at today's mortgage interest rates on a 30-year mortgage, you'd be devoting something like 40% of your pre-tax income to housing loan repayments. That's at four times. At 8 times, it's 80% of your pre-tax income, right? I mean, this is just ridiculous. And obviously, that just can't be done and won't be done. And so the people who are buying houses at 8 times income, they've got help, right? This is not all coming from their own labour. And where's the help coming from? And the help is almost certainly coming from their parents or grandparents. It's coming from family members, right? I was having this conversation with some people in Sydney the other day who are about my age, some of them a bit older, some of them a few years younger, much wealthier than I am. And they were as concerned about this question as I am. And one of them said, well, you know, at least we can look after our kids. And I said, yeah, but you think of it, right? Wealthier people typically have fewer children than those who are less wealthy. And if you're going to rely on intergenerational asset transfers to look after the younger generation, you're going to end up with increasingly concentrated wealth, right? That's what's going to happen. And where does that end up? Now, okay, we'd had a few drinks. But quick as a flash, 2 of them said it ends up in a revolution. I mean, this is where revolutions come from, isn't it?
And so if we decided that it was part of Australian values, that you should be able to afford to pay off a house without being in housing stress, you know, if you work hard, and that 8 times is too many and maybe 4 times is even too many, how do we get to there from here? You know, without, obviously, you know, either property prices have to dive, which has a whole lot of consequences, or they stay constant for 20 years while wages catch up. Or, you know, if they grow, wages grow faster. Like what's the least damaging pathway to affordable home ownership?
The least damaging pathway is certainly the second and the third, right? That you just recognise that it's going to take a long time, and it will. Well, no, I mean, you could have a very nasty property price correction, right? That would be very damaging for a whole host of reasons. So if you're talking about least damaging pathways, the least damaging pathways come from firstly recognising that, yeah, it is going to take some time, but then you go to your third point. We do have to find ways of lifting productivity in this country so that the poor buggers who are shouldering the majority of the tax burden, that is those young workers subject to personal income tax, that they're getting really decent increases in real wages. And this is the really big story of the structure of the Australian tax system that we were bound to get to, but and it's this, you know, when we in 2002 prepared the very first intergenerational report. When I say we, I mean the Treasury, which I was head of at the time. When we prepared the very first intergenerational report in 2002, which, if you know anything about it, doesn't matter, I'm going to tell you. Makes projections as it is required to do under the Charter of Budget Honesty Act that had been legislated in 1998. It makes 40-year projections of government spending. Each item, well, in big chunks, but each item of government spending. So projections over a 40-year time period, how they're going to evolve because of a whole range of circumstances, but most particularly because of the way that the population is changing, both growing but also ageing, and the impact that that's going to have on spending programs. So you make all those projections, and then, at least in the first intergenerational report, the one in 2002, so then the bottom line is, well, okay, so how might the tax bases grow over this 40-year time period? And how much are we going to have to increase tax as a proportion of gross domestic product to match the increase in government spending as a proportion of gross domestic product? And the bottom line was, in that very first intergeneration report, and there have been 5 more, 5 more since, was that government spending as a proportion of gross domestic product was going to grow by 5 percentage points, roughly from 1/4 of the economy, so from 25% to 30% over a 40-year time period, right? The budget was roughly in balance at the time. Actually, there was a small surplus, but put that to one side. So that would mean that we were going to have to eventually increase revenue as a proportion of gross domestic product from 25% to 30%. And I looked at that and I thought, we're not going to publish that. What we will publish instead is something which says, how much faster would we have to grow the economy in order to avoid that outcome? If you grow the economy faster, that doesn't increase government spending. No. And in fact, reduces the amount by which government spending grows as a proportion of the economy, of course. You know, you remember your high school arithmetic, you're growing the denominator faster than the numerator, right? And so maybe we don't have to increase tax as a proportion of GDP to meet this burgeoning spending requirement. And it's pretty, I mean, you can do this arithmetic in your head, right? So if you grow the economy over a 40-year time period at 0.5 percentage point a year faster growth, that's all you need to do, and that solves the problem. 0.5 percentage point a year. Now, at the time, we projected that productivity growth in Australia would be 1.75% a year. That's what we projected. In the preceding decade, it had averaged 2.25% a year. So when we published 1.75%, and of course from my perspective anyway, the document was designed to motivate political support for more economic reform. The journalists looked at it and thought, you're just trying to scare the horses. This is Treasury up to its old game, right? You know, productivity growth has been 2.25%, and you're saying that it's going to fall to 1.75% for 40 years. Well, over the last 20 years, it's averaged 0.75%. Right. And this means that having identified it as the big national challenge, the thing that policy really had to focus on, guess what? I don't know why, but it just has not motivated political action at all. And as you know, from the time you spend in Parliament House, there's a real sense of complacency in that place.
The jump from I got a little bit confused in thinking about how do we change that housing affordability issue, and then you moved on to how we deal with an increase in the requirement of government spending. How do we grow our way out of housing unaffordability? I don't see the link there.
The answer is faster productivity growth, right? So faster productivity growth solves both problems. That's my point. Faster productivity growth would solve the looming fiscal challenge. Had we achieved the productivity growth that we argued for in 2002, the Australian budget would not even have gone into deficit in the middle of the pandemic. It would still have been in surplus. I've done the numbers on this. It's extraordinary. I was shocked. But nevertheless, it's true. Had we achieved the rate of productivity growth that we in 2002 argued Australia needed to achieve, the budget still would have been in surplus in the middle of the pandemic. But the more important point is that it really matters to the living standards of Australian workers, because they would have got wage increases matching that higher rate of productivity growth in all those years. And I recently calculated, okay, so how much would the average worker have in their savings account had they benefited from that higher rate of productivity growth? Like, had they got that wages matching that higher rate of productivity growth rather than the productivity growth we've actually received, it's just short of $500,000 for the average worker.
So that's built on an assumption that the productivity growth goes to workers proportionally.
Yeah.
And then it also is, if it solves the housing affordability problem, we'd have to assume that house prices don't keep going up, but wages catch up faster.
So there's a real issue here, right, which we've kind of skated around a bit. Because we've been talking about house prices and the incomes of house purchasers as if they're unrelated. But they're not. Clearly they're not unrelated. The point is that prices are determined by both demand and supply, right? And you've got to keep both these things in your head when you're thinking about the price of anything, including the price of a house. And so, you know, people often say, and the government is obviously of this view, well, all we've got to do to solve the housing affordability crisis is give people more money to spend on housing. Well, hang on. What does that do? Drives up the price of houses? Of course it does. And other people say, no. What you've got to do is you've got to increase the supply of houses and that will drive down the price. That's true. If you can increase the supply of houses without increasing the demand for houses, yeah, prices will fall, right? And so those supply side constraints, such as they exist, they do have to be dealt with. And those supply side constraints seem to have most to do with planning restrictions and costs that are loaded onto developers in the form of development charges and all that kind of stuff. And that's understandable, and that surely can be dealt with. But then on the demand side, maybe we've got to do something about the demand for housing as well, right? Look, every time, you know, house prices go in cycles. The reason they go in cycles has got very little to do with the supply side. Like, the supply is pretty much constant in the short term and has some elasticity over the longer term. But what drives the house price cycle, and it appears that we might be going into another one, so hold on to your seats, is what's happening on the demand side. People say, now's the time to buy, I've got to get in, fear of missing out and all that kind of stuff, right? And the clearest indicator of this is just look at the proportion of house purchases that are going to investors as opposed to owner-occupiers. When you see that investor to owner-occupier ratio move up, you know we're in for it, right? And the reason is that, you know, if you can get full mortgage interest deductibility and you expect most of your income is going to come in the form of a lightly taxed capital gain, well, of course, it's a fantastic investment, right? I mean, you may get scorched, you may be wrong, but the historical evidence is pretty strongly in support of that as being a pretty astute investment. And so you do have the tax system driving this acceleration in housing prices that occurs about once every 6 or 7 years in Australia, historically, driven by the tax system, driven by this demand for investor housing.
So is the answer then address the supply issues?
Yeah.
And do what we can about demand by reducing the difference between the tax incentives for investors and the tax incentives for homeowners?
Well, no, not that so much. I mean, the homeowners, they're getting a tax incentive as well, it's just in a different form. No, really, what I'm talking about is reducing the difference between the way that housing as an asset is taxed and other investments are taxed. That's what I'm talking about, right? So we have a tax system that makes it really, really attractive for people to borrow money to invest in residential housing as investors, right? Obviously. rather than, or maybe at the expense of, productive businesses. You know? That's a real issue. Investments in the productive businesses, that's where the productivity comes from. Obviously, that's a tautology. And that's what builds the higher real wages growth, right? Whereas the investment in housing as a fixed asset, no, that doesn't, right? That doesn't. It just lifts prices.
So realign incentives so that people put their money into productive assets rather than housing.
Yep.
Now we've almost run out of time before we move to Q&A. Can I ask you, before we have a quick comfort break, tax reform, so you put together this review that had 130 recommendations in it or something, less than 5 of which have been taken up in that period.
It's only 15 years. 15
years, yeah, that's right. Can you do tax reform piecemeal?
No.
Okay, that was a quick answer, wasn't it? What will it take to actually progress tax reform politically? How can it be done?
Yeah, well, so I'm not a political scientist, right? Political scientists would speak about this topic with, enormous conviction and certainty, and I feel deeply uncertain about all this. But I do observe some stuff that makes me think that if we have renewed interest in broad-based tax reform, and the political system is going to have to come in a way that it hasn't come previously. What I'm getting at is that typically it's come out of a political contest, typically in Australia. I mean, John Howard went to the 1996 election campaign promising there would never ever be a GST, right? And a little over 12 months later, he appointed me to lead a tax review task force to produce the design of the GST, among other things, right? Why? Because the politics of the time compelled him to do something big and bold and courageous.
How do we create those politics of the time again?
That's the point, isn't it? Because I would say right now, I just can't see it. I cannot see it. Doesn't seem to me that there's any reform pressure on the incumbent government at all.
At the last election, the tax reform agenda was $5 off your tax each year or $7 off your petrol tax.
Yeah,
your choices.
Yeah. I mean, it's silly stuff, right? It's really silly stuff. So where does it come from? And there's just not much community involvement. Okay, I mean, you're all interested. That's fantastic. How many people in Australia are really interested in this conversation? I don't know. Where are the young people? Some of you are relatively young.
Maybe there. There's
there
one.
You go, right?
Yeah.
So there's fantastic. But well, let me put the question this way. When I was you were born in 1975. I turned 18 in November 1975. I was thinking about that the other day, a couple of days ago. And I remember, no, I'm not suggesting people do this necessarily, but I remember as a teenager leading street demonstrations in the country town that I grew up in. Street demonstrations about things like the Vietnam War, things like welder dismissal, had a big impact on me. I turned 18 in November 1975. And I just don't see it. I mean, these were the motive force of politics when I was a kid seemed to come from young people, and I don't think that it looked to me that way just because I was young. I don't think that's true. I think you look back now, young people were very politically engaged, Very political.
So there needs to be demand from the community and a demand from younger generations that the deal is different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We might stop there and have a 5-minute comfort break. Thank you very much, Ken. Grab a beer, ready, and come back with questions. Time flies.
Jeez, I can't believe that was 45 minutes, really?
It's actually 50. Yeah.
My God. There you go.
Come and have a second beer and we'll...
Yep.
I have a gift for you.
Ah.
Which is a 5-page
Oh, wow. You can do it in 5 pages. I took 1,000.
No, really?
That's okay. We don't like anybody. Yeah. You're fine.
young people.